Welcome, I'm Todd Robbins. You know, people have been calling each other terrible names since the beginning of civilization, and though someone may insult you this way, it really means nothing whatsoever. However, there was a time several centuries ago that if people called you a certain name, it was not only an insult, but it also could lead to your death. And that name was witch. The golden age of witch hunting was from about 1450 to 1750, and during those 300 years, it's estimated that there was probably about 30,000 to 100,000 people that were executed because someone pointed a finger at them and accused them of being a witch. Now we have an image of witches being burned at the stake, and it did happen. However, the predominating way that witches were executed was by hanging them. It was very efficient. All you needed was a rope and a branch of a tree. However, you could add a lot more spectacle to it by erecting a gallows in a town square and then hanging the witch and then allowing their corpse to dangle there in the wind for days or weeks even as a message, a warning to people of what would happen to them if they pissed off God by being different from everyone else. Now, what I find fascinating is not so much the method of execution, whether it be burning or hanging or anything like that. No, what I think is fascinating is the great lengths that people of religious or political authority, and back then it was often the same thing, the great lengths that they would go to prove that someone was a witch. There were many torturous ways of proving someone was a witch, often led directly to execution. For instance, there was this belief that a witch, because they were in league with the devil, couldn't utter a single word of a prayer or a Bible passage or some other religious writing. Of course, many witches were able to do this and do it well. And so therefore, the persecutors upped the ante. And they said, if you made any mistakes while saying a prayer or a Bible passage, a religious writing of some kind, if you missed a word or you stammered or stuttered, well, that proved that you were a witch, and then you would be burned or hung. But even if you were able to recite flawlessly, it didn't get you off the hook. There was a fellow by the name of George Burroughs who, on the gallows, recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly. And this pissed off the powers that be. So they conferred a little bit, and they came back and said what he did was a trick of the devil. And then they put him to death. There was also a strange test known as witch cakes. What they would do is they would take the urine of someone who had been cursed by a witch, and they mix the urine, the witch hunters would mix the urine with a rye flour, rye meal, and a little ash, and they would bake it into this cake. And then they would force feed it on an animal, a familiar. This was the belief that demons would take the form of a cat or a dog and then serve the biddings of a witch. So they would force feed the animal this wretched mess of a concoction, a little confection. And it was believed that the animal would fall under the spell of the witch cake, miraculously gain the ability to speak, and then name the guilty sorcerer. Of course, this didn't happen, and when it didn't happen, well, then the witch hunters would turn on the person who made the witch cake and accuse them of being a witch. There was also dunking, or ducking, as it was sometimes called. In its simplest form, your hands and feet would be bound and you'd be thrown into a large body of water, whether it be a pond or a river or a lake, something like that, whatever was handy. And if you sunk to the bottom, which most people did, and drowned, as most people did, well, that meant you weren't a witch, and even though you were dead, you would be going to heaven. However, if you floated to the top, well, good for you, but bad for you also. You see, there was some sort of belief that again, because they were in league with the devil, that some sort of problem with baptism. The witches couldn't be baptized, water would reject them, and that's why they would float. So if you did bob to the surface, well, then they would drag you out of the water and hang you. Or they would dry you off a little bit and then burn you. There was also pressing. You would ask to be lie down on the ground. They'd ask you that, and then they put a large board, a wide board on top of you and put stones, heavy stones, on top of that board, more and more of them, making the weight greater and greater and greater until you confessed. And then when you confessed, well, it was very efficient, because they would continue putting stones on top of that board until you were crushed to death. And if you didn't confess, they would then put more and more weight on the board until you're crushed to death. Because if you're accused of being a witch, that meant you probably were one. There was also something called the pair of anguish. It sounds so poetic, doesn't it? A pair of anguish. Almost sounds benign, but it's not. No, this was a device that would be inserted in one of your orifices. And since the idea was to get you to confess, the orifice was not your mouth. They would insert it into an orifice and they expand it. And expand it and expand it until you couldn't take it anymore, and then you'd confess. And then if you did confess, then they'd rip it out of your orifice, and then you'd be hung or burned. And if you didn't confess, well, they just keep expanding it until that device ruptured your orifice and you'd bleed to death. Win-win. There was also pricking. They would take a needle and prick you with it. And if it hurt and bled, well, that meant you weren't a witch. However, if it didn't hurt or it didn't bleed, well, that meant you were a witch, and you'd be hung or burned, of course. And even if you did bleed or it did hurt, well, sometimes they would prick you over and over again in different spots all over your body until they found one that didn't hurt or didn't bleed as much as the others. And then you'd be burned or hung. And there was also the witch's mark. A very pious person would strip you of all of your clothes and then look your body over, your naked flesh, until they found a mark or a blemish, and that proved you're a witch. And when they found the mark, and they always found the mark, you would then be burned or hung. Now, I'm not a betting man, and yet I'm willing to wager that many of the very, very religious folks gained a great deal of pleasure from inflicting this mayhem upon people, a pleasure that had nothing to do with holiness. Now, we look upon this time and all these awful things that were done, and we scratch our head as to how it was possible. And the reason we do this is because of, well, time. You see, it's been a long time since all these things happened. And time has a way of, well, causing madness to fade away and rational thought to once again come forth. And the thing about it is, though those days of, putting people to death because they're a witch are long gone, and there are people, hundreds, maybe thousands of people who proclaim that they're witches without any kind of fear that will lead to a death sentence. Those days of persecuting witches are over. The root of all that happened back then, that hysteria, is still with us today and bearing fruit. There is a difference between what drove those witch hunts and what drives the crusades of today, but it's only on the surface. Underneath it all is hatred. These days, there's a number of different kinds of hatred in our world. Hatred that will drive people to want you dead because of, let's say, your religion or the color of your skin, or the country of your origin, or your religion, or your sexuality, or even your gender, or your religion, or your political beliefs. Now, we like to think that the tumultuous times in which we find ourselves, well, this too shall pass. And once again, rational thought will rule the day. But there's no guarantee of that whatsoever. No, there's a difference these days. There's a diversity in the hatred we find around us. There's a full spectrum of hate that we find in our world today. And it is very possible that it will be this hatred, not war or famine or even pestilence, that will do us in, but it will be this diverse divisiveness, the malevolent point of views of our fellow men and women that will lead to the demise of our world. It's an intriguing thought, isn't it? It's positively bewitching. Well, there you go, and there you have it. I hope you enjoyed these few moments we spent together here, and I hope you'll return. And we can do this again at another time, and I hope it's soon, because it's much later than you think. I know. I'm Todd Robbins. Thank you for watching Deceptionations. Say, do me a favor, if you enjoyed it,
Like this video, damn it.
and also,
Subscribe or else.
please don't make me come after you. Thanks.